Florida State wide receiver Keon Coleman has been overrated through the entire draft process, but now he's underrated. All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also check out her work at Pro Football Focus and Behind the Steel Curtain. On today's show, we are breaking down Florida State wide receiver Keon Coleman, who has been one of the most controversial players in this class so far. We're going to discuss his dynasty value, some player comps, dive into some advanced numbers. But Kate, let's start with a tape. What did you see when you watched Keon Coleman on tape?
Yeah, the very basics on Keon Coleman. He's a young wide receiver, 20 years old. He's going to turn 21 in May. Spent 2 seasons with Michigan State before transferring to Florida State for his final season in 2023. Now, the stats aren't going to blow you away. And I mean, just to be clear, never had a monstrous season, never put a really complete season together, albeit, again, pretty young guy. So 2022 at Michigan State had a career high yardage, 798 receiving yards, averaged 13.8 yards per reception, 7 touchdowns. In his first season at Florida State, 50 catches, 658 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns. So did see a little bit of that bump in terms of touchdown production. He's a bigger wide receiver, measured in at 6 foot, 3 inches and a quarter at the NFL Combine. That's 86th percentile for wide receivers. Also has, a thick build, 213 pounds, that's 77th percentile. Solid length. Did struggle in terms of his 40-yard dash, though. 4.61 second 40-yard dash, 17th percentile for wide receivers. But generally what you're going to get when you're looking at Keon Coleman is kind of an inconsistent player. But Marcus, the tape, like some of the most inconsistent tape you'll see, because he can make some absolutely freakish circus catches that will have your jaw on the floor. But my biggest issue with Keon Coleman is not those circus catches. Everybody loves a good OBJ arm extension play, but it's what you see in between the downs that I think is the most disappointing for Keon Coleman, because lacks a lot of consistency in terms of down-to-down play, not necessarily as much play strength as I would like to see given the size. I do think he has probably more burst than maybe you would have guessed based on his 40-yard dash time, but there's a lot of room. I'm going to say there's a lot of room for growth for Keon Coleman coming into this draft process.
Yeah, I agree with just about everything you said. He's tough to peg, because you mentioned the combine stats, and if you're watching with us on YouTube, you can see his mock draftable chart. I mean, he's a big receiver. So if he was 6'1" and 203 pounds and running a 4.61, that's probably like a death knell, right? But not for him, because being that big and that physical at least allows him to be a weapon. And you can see the other numbers. The jump scores were all, 79th percentile or better. The 10-yard split was 60th percentile or better. It's just he doesn't have long speed. And then on top of that, he's just not a good route runner, which let's go to the strengths and the weaknesses, Kate, because big, young, physical, check. I mean, those are a lot of the things that you want when it comes to a fantasy asset and a dynasty asset. He is explosive. We're going to get to the 40-yard dash in a second, but you can see sometimes when he catches the ball, like that first step is really good. He can break tackles because his lower body is so strong. He's also good with the ball in his hands, and that's why Florida State allowed him to return punts. He averaged over 12 yards per punt return in his career at Florida State, and that's despite not having a single touchdown. So it's not like he had one 80-yard return and then a bunch of nothings. Like he was consistently having productive returns in the punt game. My issues with Coleman is he doesn't create separation. He doesn't have top end speed. He's not a good route runner. And there's not really a single route that he runs well right now. And then on top of that all, the production is pretty lackluster. Like there's not 1,000-yard receiving season. Even at Florida State this year, Johnny Wilson, who was in this draft, outproduced him pretty easily. So it's a big projection. You're really hoping that as he grows as a player, he becomes a better route runner. He gets a little bit quicker. He gets a little bit more long speed, because right now there's just not a lot to hang your hat on when it comes to his game.
Yeah, and I think like the positives for Keon Coleman, you're basically betting, I think, on the physical attributes coming in and hopefully refining some of those like natural receiving traits that maybe he lacks. He has solid enough hands, just 2 drops this past season. But like generally speaking, the way that we talk about like Marvin Harrison Jr. having this innate feel for the wide receiver position and doing all these little things in terms of route running, and it, like Keon Coleman needs a lot of room to develop there. But a former basketball player there at Michigan State, like you
And you
saw
see
the
that.
jump scores, like
Yeah. He
the
plays like a
it's
basketball player at times.
yes, and you do see that. Now, I would like to see him play with a little bit more play strength. It didn't feel like he had as much upper body strength as he does lower body strength, but the yards after the catch ability just leads me to this idea that I feel like Keon Coleman is going to be one of these guys that I would have concerns depending on what kind of coaching staff he goes into, because I think Keon Coleman's probably going to be a guy that you have to have a little bit of imagination with. More solid after the catch than you would generally guess for like his size. I think he's got a lot of movement skills in that way. I want to see I want to see his NFL offense generate touches for him and let him make plays on the ball. He's going to profile as an outside wide receiver, but I'd kind of like to see him working over the middle of the field, because where you saw, I think, some of his best plays is when you had some schemes generating a little bit more space, because he's not going to create that naturally as a wide receiver based on his route running as it stands today.
Yeah, I'm gonna save my player comp for the end of the show, but I agree with you. Like I think if he gets miscast as like an outside X receiver that's going up against press coverage on every snap, I think he'll fail in a lot of the ways that like Treylon Burks and Quentin Johnston have failed early in their careers. Like he's just not an outside receiver. Where he's gonna win is like as a power slot, and I think
Yes.
if you compare him to like, again, I'm not using this comparison, but I think he could fill a similar role to like a bigger Tyler Boyd a little bit earlier in his career. And you mentioned something. You said he's a natural receiver. I agree with you. Like that's one of the things I want to give him credit for. Like you can see he's an easy mover. He's very fluid. And even in like the gauntlet drill at the NFL Combine, like he made it look effortless. But again, that's running in a straight line and just catching footballs. When it comes to running routes, that's where I have some concerns, Kate.
It's the lack of finesse as a wide receiver. So like the little, and I think probably out of all the things he did at the combine, the burst scores were great. Obviously the 40-yard dash time, disappointing, but not a deal breaker given his size. The gauntlet drill, I feel like is really where he probably shined. I think he actually clocked like a relatively high speed
He did.
on the mile, or what do you call that? The GPS score.
Yep.
Like actually probably won back some bonus points there in the gauntlet drill. Again, just solid hands. It's just like these little things that make that transition to the NFL that much easier. The abilities as a route runner, like I'm so concerned about that lack of ability to separate. That is where I have my biggest troubles, I think. And because it's going to, I think, again, be really scheme dependent for him, depending on how creative an offensive coordinator can get for him, and if they don't pigeonhole him on the outside, because honestly I don't want to see him play on the outside,
No,
because I don't
no.
I don't think he's going to have the skill set that's going to win against NFL caliber cornerbacks. You mentioned it, the power slot role. I think that would be perfect role for Keon Coleman.
All right, Kate, I want to dive into the advanced numbers because there's a couple that make me feel encouraged. There's some other ones that make me feel really concerned moving forward. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is now an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer that it gets to first pitch, with killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat in their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I love that you can go and get 60% off if you buy last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever kind of event you're going to. You can even save more if you go to the in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Kate, let's look at some of the advanced numbers for Keon Coleman. What do we got?
Again, kind of a little bit of a mismatch here in terms of what he's doing on the field. You actually look at some of his more advanced metrics via Player Profiler and college dominator rating, 81st percentile, college target share, 70th percentile, breakout age, 19.3, ranks in the 82nd percentile. But Marcus, you again look at the competition, the level of competition, and sometimes those numbers can seem a little bit skewed. Like when you're dominating a Michigan State offense in your second season, in even that level of competition in 2022 only yielded 798 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. Like, yeah, like you're dominating your respective offense. It doesn't mean as much as if you're at a big time program. Not as much. What's probably the most concerning for me, Marcus, you look at like the advanced metrics versus PFF, the sticky stats. Not an overwhelmingly exciting profile. 31st percentile in yards per route run, 64th percentile yards after the catch per reception, which you love to see. That was something we highlighted as strength for him.
Mm-hmm.
0th, I don't even know how to say this word, 0th reception last in separation percentage against single coverage, which that is the most concerning number to me. And that is the one that, like, yeah, despite the yards after the catch production, like I keep going back to that separation percentage and I say, okay, like that lack of creativity as a route runner is going to have to give at some point at the next level.
Yeah, it makes me concerned. So just to give you some more data behind that one, Pro Football Focus has charted all these college receivers during the 2023 season in terms of how well he separated against single coverage, 450th out of 451 receivers. I mean, that's horrendous, Kate. I mean, absolutely horrendous. What's even not more concerning, but also concerning is that he's just not very good against zone coverage. He ranked 345th out of 464 receivers. That's typically it's a telltale sign that you're just not a very crafty route runner if you just can't figure out how to get open against zone coverage. Now, I will say one of the things that does have me a little bit encouraged is the yards after the catch per reception. You referenced it, 6.3 yards after the catch per reception. It's fine. It's not elite, but it is pretty good for a receiver at his side. So if you can get him in the right situation where he can catch the ball on the move, I do think he's going to be hard to bring down for some smaller cornerbacks and safeties. It's just, does that outweigh how bad he is at creating separation?
Uh, yeah, kind of. Like,
A little bit, right? I mean, it saves him, right? If he was somebody who was like in the 30th or 40th percentile in yards after the catch per reception, we're talking about a 7th-round pick because you're just drafting somebody based on their
yeah,
size, right? This at least keeps him in the discussion as a day 2 pick. And I just want to back up for a second. One of the reasons why I think a lot of people were calling him overrated early in this draft process is because we saw people mocking him pretty frequently, like inside the top 20 or top 25 picks.
asinine.
Yeah, you just can't, right? Like, he doesn't have the long speed, he doesn't have the production, and the advanced numbers aren't there. However, once we start talking about him as a 2nd-round pick, I think it's easier to get on board. I do think we've gotten to the point where maybe he is a little underrated.
I'm I'm holding back a little bit here, Marcus, because I think a lot more skeptical on Keon Coleman just in general from a dynasty perspective. And Keon Coleman, again, might be one of these guys that comes in because of his kind of ability as an athlete, like the size burst combination. Like, that's going to win you some points. The ability to contribute on special teams, that's going to win you a ton of points in the NFL. This is why I could see Keon Coleman ending up being a guy that is more highly regarded in the draft community, maybe versus the dynasty community, where I
Well,
think he's going to have an uphill battle to be an every down type of receiver.
I will say one of the reasons why I think you're seeing some of the fantasy managers still like him is because of the age, which we should mention. He's only 20 years old
Mhm.
right now. He doesn't turn 21 until after the draft. This is an old wide receiver class. Like, you have multiple prospects who are going to play their rookie season at age 24. I think Ricky Pearsall from Florida will be 24 before the season begins. I know Xavier Legette is an older prospect. He's a 1-year breakout. I believe he will be 24 during his rookie season. So you're hoping, 2 to 3 years from now, he gets better as a route runner. He gets a little bit more athletic. And what would Keon Coleman have looked like if he would have stayed in school for 2 more years and went and played with a really good quarterback, like maybe Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors did? Now, Neighbors is a bad comp because he's super young as well. But you do have to project a little bit the age here, because I do think he's going to be a different receiver 2 years down the line.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And that's why I think, again, landing spot for Keon Coleman, like, I think a lot of these kind of mid-range wide receivers, it's going to be key. Shouting out like some of the quarterback play, ranked 749th among 829 qualifying wide receivers in terms of catchable target rate, 60.9% catchable target rate in his final season with FSU. That kind of tells you everything you need to know. And we've talked about what kind of impact that can have on your production profile, because if you don't have an ideally placed ball, that can limit your opportunities for yards after the catch, which, again, that's even more encouraging probably for Keon Coleman's ability in that regard.
Mhm.
I think once he has the ball in his hands, a solid kind of vision for the field, it's just going to have to come together pretty perfectly for Keon Coleman. But
Oh, well.
he's got a lot of the athletic traits that, in the right offense, under the right coaching staff, can be molded into a high-end wide receiver too for a given offense, I think.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some potential landing spots, because I do think that's going to matter a lot for Keon Coleman. I also want to talk about his dynasty value and some player comps. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's the first thing that you would do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you go for a run? How about take a nap, read a book, show up for a friend? A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? the best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can go and do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's done entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for any reason at no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We are discussing Florida State wide receiver Keon Coleman. And Kate, where does he currently rank among Dynasty wide receivers?
He's in an interesting spot, actually. You mentioned the potential for value here. Currently being valued as wide receiver 9 in Dynasty wide receiver rookie rankings, consensus rankings via Fantasy Pros. I mean, you look at the names that are ahead of him, and they're not overly surprising. Actually, all the wide receivers we've covered so far in this series, obviously, you have the top 3: Brian Thomas, Troy Franklin, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, A.D. Mitchell, and Keon Coleman here at number 9, which I'm going to be honest, I'm kind of up and down about this spot, and it's probably going to, that this ranking is definitely going to be very landing spot dependent for me. But it feels a little high because I look at some wide receivers behind him, a Roman Wilson, a Malachi Corley, who I think have maybe a similar ceiling, different types of players, obviously, but Keon Coleman, I could picture having a very low floor at the next level, which makes him a little bit more inherently risky for me. Is there upside? Yes, but the low floor has me hesitant to buy in. Now, I want to hear your player comp for Keon Coleman, this very divisive project, who, again, a lot of traits that you're really going to want in a wide receiver at the next level. Who do you got?
He reminds me a lot of Allen Robinson coming out of Penn State. Now, Robinson was 6'2.5", over 210 pounds, also ran a 4.6 40-yard dash. But just like Keon Coleman, was very good in the jump scores. He had a 39-inch vertical, a 127 broad jump, and also had the quick 10-yard split, 154. Now, I think Robinson was a better route runner coming out of Penn State, but I think their roles in the NFL are going to be very similar, where you want them to be a big slot, winning above their heads, and just not having to win on precise routes, but basically a lot of 50-50 balls. I think he can do that. Now, Allen Robinson early in his career went to a team that wasn't great, but did go to the Jags, who had Blake Bortles, who would just throw him 50-50 balls all the time. I think if you can get him with the right coach, the right quarterback, I do think he could be successful, Kate, which brings me to landing spot. I want to ask you, where do you think, or what team do you think would make a lot of sense for him? Because I think we can rule out probably first round now. I mean, unless it's like the very back end of the first round. But where would you like to see him land?
There are 2 things that I think could be advantageous. So something with Allen Robinson is volume. Volume was key. He's never been like the most efficient wide receiver in the league.
No.
But volume has been a tremendous asset. Even when he became an NFL wide receiver, it's not like we saw him grow a ton in terms of his ability to separate in general. Throughout his career, 57.3 open target rate, that ranks in the 23rd percentile, dating back to 2014. Not necessarily going to win that way unless you have a ton of volume. So I want to see him go to a situation where he becomes a default, maybe guy who is going to get a ton of targets. Like you mentioned, some of those 50-50 balls that aren't always the most advisable, generally speaking, from an NFL quarterback. But where I think like he's really going to win at the next level, if he can get typecast in the role, is the power slot role. Like I would love to see him go to an offense where he doesn't have to be the wide receiver 1. What about an offense like the Bengals, as they're sort of in flux with T. Higgins? They have lost Tyler Boyd coming out of the slot, which we mentioned at the top of the show, kind of maybe a bigger version of Tyler Boyd.
Yeah.
a good quarterback who, even if he's unable to separate, Joe Burrow, an elite passer with good ball placement, can maybe work out some of those deficiencies in his game. I think he's either going to need a lot of volume or he's going to need to be with a quarterback with some elite ball placement. Joe Burrow is probably my favorite guy to do it.
I think that's a great fit. And I know people will automatically say he's the next T. Higgins, but actually, you mentioned like Boyd's the better fit. Like play him in a slot, let him be the physical guy. Maybe use Charlie Jones or Yoshi on the outside opposite of Jamar Chase to give you some speed. Love that. I also really like the fit in with the Saints. Chris Olave, one of the premier deep threat receivers in the league, one of the better route runners in the league. They've moved on from Michael Thomas. I think Keon Coleman can do a lot of what Michael Thomas has did early in his career, where you just use him on slants. Remember that they used to call him Slant Boy because he basically just box out everybody. Derek Carr is actually pretty good at throwing to bigger receivers. I think that makes a lot of sense as well. And then I'll give you one more. Like, if the Falcons want to continue to build like this just big bully offense, and you want to have Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Keon Coleman as your three big weapons in the passing game with Darnell Mooney as your speedster, I think that makes a lot of sense as well, because one of the things we didn't mention is that I think Keon Coleman's a pretty good blocker. So if you're on a team that really wants to run the ball effectively, he will block for you. I think there's a lot of teams, Kate, in that range of like picks 40 to 55 that would be interested in Keon Coleman as like a number 3 receiver right away.
Now, this, not necessarily the best fit, because I do think they have other needs elsewhere, but the Steelers definitely going to be in the market for a quote unquote wide receiver too. I think they need somebody that's going to be able to contribute a lot more quickly than Keon Coleman. But you mentioned the comp with Allen Robinson. I actually think probably what they were hoping they were still going to get out of an aging Allen Robinson after the torn ACL, like after all this, I think they were kind of hoping that they would get, something similar to old school Allen Robinson. Maybe they'd find that in Keon Coleman. And, right now their option at the slot is probably going to be like Calvin Austin, who is literally the opposite player you're going to get out of Keon Coleman here. You also have, his ability to return, which Steelers love that ability to contribute on special teams, especially. I wouldn't hate him going to the Steelers, although I do think that they need probably a little bit more stability, a little bit more quickly than they're going to get out of Keon Coleman.
Really quickly before we go, I just want to throw back up the rookie rankings. I would have him a little higher. I would have him ahead of Troy Franklin, who we previewed on our show last week. I wouldn't put him ahead of Xavier Worthy. I wouldn't put him ahead of AD Mitchell. I think Ladd McConkey and Keon Coleman is a little bit of a toss-up for me, but I do think he's a little underrated. Like, I think wide receiver 7, wide receiver 8 feels about right. And I think with a potentially positive landing spot, he could be even a little bit higher. So I'm officially on I don't love the tape, but I think he's a little underrated because he's been hated so much during the pre-draft process.
All right, Marcus, we're going to disagree on this one, but that's okay. I'm sure we will agree on more prospects to come.
Just to be clear, I don't love him. I think we've gotten to the point where everybody has hated on him a little bit too much, where if everybody's calling you overrated, maybe you are a tad underrated. All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. On tomorrow's show, okay, let's do Roman Wilson, who's currently being drafted as wide receiver 10 in startup drafts. We'll talk about the Michigan wide receiver on Tuesday's show. Make sure you're downloading the podcast wherever you get your podcast. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus _Mosher. We will see you right back here tomorrow.